Here, the fundamentals of spey casting. How many of you guys have used a two-hand rod before? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, so most people are familiar with it, right? So as you know, a spey cast is a change of direction with a dynamic D-loop. What does that mean? Well, all of our spey casts incorporate principles from our roll cast and our overhead cast. And the most fundamental principle of all our spey casting is we're going to form a back cast with a loop of line underneath the rod tip. We call this a D-loop. So you can see my rod and my line here, where they intersect, it makes a shape of a D, right? So it makes sense. We call it a D-loop. This loop of line loads our rod. So just like in our roll cast, this is the weight that puts the bend into the rod. Now in a regular traditional roll cast, that is a static line roll cast, we have a lot of line that's stuck on the surface of the water. This is called an anchor. So when we're making our static line roll cast, we don't normally think of those terms, a D-loop and an anchor. When we're spey casting, we're always concerned with both our D-loop and our anchor. The bigger our D-loop, the more weight we have behind the rod. This is what's going to help load this rod, put a bend in it. The bigger the D-loop, the less anchor or line we have that's stuck to the surface of the water. Inverse relationship here. The longer the line on the water, the bigger the anchor, what happens to the D-loop? Smaller it is, right? So one thing that we have to do with all of our spey casting is figure out a way to increase the size of the D-loop and reduce the footprint of the anchor on the surface of the water. That's the dynamic part of a roll cast. This is static. There's no energy here in this D-loop, in this big anchor that's on the surface of the water. In order for me to turn over this line and deliver my fly to a target, I have to use a lot of energy, right, to get this line back, to get this to turn over downstream. If I can increase the size of my D-loop, I can reduce the amount of energy that I have to expend in order to turn over the line and deliver my fly to the target. So even if I just reach this out to the side and try to make a bigger D-loop, that's a little bit easier, right? A little more effort, a little bit easier. A little more effort, a little bit easier. And now if I jump it all the way back, wow, really easy, right? That's because I get the whole line, which is weight, underneath the tip of the rod. I get this whole line back here, underneath the tip of the rod, and I have a very small anchor. What happens if I have no anchor at all, though? I can get load on the rod, but we're no longer forming a D-loop necessarily underneath the tip, right? So in order for us to hold the shape of that D, hold the energy in the shape of that D, we need that anchor. If we don't have an anchor, you're correct, the anchor blows out or kicks out, or we lift the rod too high, it kicks out in the back, then we're giving all that energy away. So it's almost like an overhead cast. I can still make the cast, and in fact, we use this type of cast all the time rods, it's called a Belgian cast or a circle cast, where we're not touching the water. Coming off to the side, goes under the tip of the rod over. It's a very powerful cast, but we're not actually forming a D-loop, right? Because there's no anchor that's touched on the surface of the water. The advantage for forming these D-loops and having an anchor in spey casting is that we can make a cast that gives us a change of direction with very little room behind us. Now, you always have to think about the line that you're using. This particular line right here is a shooting head that's very short. So all the weight that's necessary to load this rod is contained in this very short head length. Having a shooting head allows me to create a very small D-loop behind me, still load the rod, and make a powerful forward cast. If I had the same amount of weight here, but stretched over a greater length, I would need more room behind me to make that big D-loop to load the rod in order to make that forward cast. So a lot of guys have gone to fishing shooting heads because they're shorter, they contain all the weight, and it allows us to fish in much tighter quarters. And around the Great Lakes here, we don't always have a big river like this that we're going to fish, right? A lot of the rivers that we fish are much smaller, and we've got lots of obstructions behind us. So being able to have a small D-loop that still loads the rod is a very useful thing. Now, another very important principle of spey casting is the 180-degree rule. So we already know we need a big D-loop and a small anchor to load the rod. And we know that spey casting is all about changing direction. But I can't change the direction like this very efficiently. In order for any cast to work properly, and this is true with a single hand rod as well as a two-hand rod, whether it's an overhead cast, roll cast, or a spey cast, we always have to obey the 180-degree rule. And that rule says, wherever my target is, my back cast should be 180 degrees to my target, always. So if my target's straight downstream and I'm making a roll cast, my back cast should be 180 degrees to my target. My overhead cast should be 180 degrees to my target. Why? That's how your rod works, right? Your rod has a spine on it. This is what bends. So when this rod flexes back under the weight of the line, where does it want to return to? 180 degrees, right? It's not going to go 90 degrees. So how do we get a change of direction then, right? How do we do that? Well, spey casting is really all about the setup. So if I know that my target is directly across the river, where does my back cast have to be? 180 degrees from my target. That means that I have to somehow manipulate my line so that I can make a D-loop under the tip of the rod that's pointed 180 degrees. And there's lots of ways to do this. All spey casts can be broken into two parts. The first part, the contrived cast. And that simply is a made-up motion to get the end of our line into a position that I can form a D-loop behind an anchor 180 degrees to my turn. So here's one cast that we do. There it goes. Another cast. Now those two casts have different types of anchors. We said that the anchor is the portion of line that sticks on the surface of water that allows us to hold that shape and energy of the D-loop so that it loads the rod. The first cast that I made is called a double Spey. That's what we call a waterborne anchor cast. We actually use the surface of the water to hold that line before we clear it, form a D-loop, 180 degrees to the target, delivering our fly with our forward cast. Watch that again. So I'm going to use a totally made-up motion of the rod, the contrived motion, that's going to jump my anchor from downstream to about 1 rod length away from me. Then I'm going to pick up all the line off the surface of the water, direct the energy into a D-loop that's pointed 180 degrees at my target. Whoa. Do that one again. Waterborne anchor. I'm dumping the line on the surface of the water, using that to help preload the rod, clearing that line so that I have some energy to direct into the D-loop. That's what makes it dynamic. The second cast that I made is called a snake roll. That's an airborne anchor. Airborne anchors are a little more difficult because it's one fluid motion of the rod that jumps the anchor into position and forms the D-loop at the same time underneath the rod tip that's pointed 180 degrees at our target. One more. You can see that one motion, jumped that anchor upstream and formed a D-loop right behind it. It was pointed 180 degrees, ready for the forward cast. That's why I describe the Spey cast as a change of direction with a dynamic roll cast. We have to change the direction first. Then we make the forward cast, not the other way around. We're always changing the direction first. Hey, Will? Yes. We got a big storm on the radar? Yeah. Okay, great. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, no, maybe?
Any tips about the forward cast?
Sure. The forward cast is a very critical part of all of our Spey casting. This is what transfers the energy from our rod through the line to deliver the fly to the target. So, once we're in what's called the key position, in the key position, similar to a static line roll cast, is the top hand, level with the ear, maybe sometimes a little bit slightly behind it. Okay? Once we're in this position right here, how do we transfer the energy? The most efficient way is first to get the rod tip moving in a straight line. What we want to do is take this rod from A to B, from B to C. Notice this shallow V shape in my top hand. We're always looking for the shallow V. Anytime we're using a shooting head, especially. Because shooting heads are so short, the top hand is going to travel a very short distance. The longer the head is, the longer the distance we're going to travel with the top hand in the casting stroke. I'm using a very short head here, so I want a very short casting stroke, and I want a nice high rod tip, or a nice high stop of the rod tip, so that I have a trajectory that's going up. because these heads are so short, we need to shoot line to make up the distance. The most important thing is to engage the bottom hand in all of your forward casting. So it's this bottom hand bank that's pulling into the body. So if I pull this down, really get a lot of power pulling down and then bottom hand pulling in. So the bottom hand is actually pulling down and then in. And it doesn't have to pull down very far. What we don't want is a seesaw. We don't want the two hands to be working like this. We don't want it seesawing or pivoting around a point in the middle. The bottom hand leads and drives the line out forward. So the most important thing with all of the forward casts that we perform